Hi all, welcome back to Environmental Science. Today I just want to talk about one kind of concept, and we've talked a little bit about this in class, and you'll do assignments on it or an assignment on this particular topic, and that is invasive species or introduced species or non-native species, pests, the whole kind of gamut around species that maybe have been brought accidentally on purpose to a new environment. Okay, so if we're talking about an introduced species and the role that they might play, so maybe we introduce this on purpose. Okay, so we take one species from a different region and drop it into a new region, and let's say that that introduced species is more suited for the current environment, is better at competing, is, maybe it's larger, maybe it has more distinct properties that allow for it to compete, maybe it's toxic, poisonous, maybe it occurs in higher numbers, maybe it can withstand different pH, different temperature, different turbidity. Like, there's all kinds of ways at which an introduced species may get the upper hand on the native species. Sometimes they prey upon them. Okay, so sometimes the introduced species is eating naive species underneath them. So maybe we introduce something at towards the top of the trophic level, maybe apex predator or secondary consumer, or maybe even a primary consumer, and the things that it's consuming are naive to that predator, never evolved with that predator, so they have no defenses against that predator, and they tend to perish a lot quicker and have more negative effects. Now, I just want you to realize that there's lots and lots of introduced species that occur daily all over the world that don't get established. Okay? The ones that we talk about often in environmental science, ecology, biology in general, are the ones that get established, and for that matter have a negative effect on native populations, and maybe beneficially there is no benefit to them, and so I want you to think though about that concept, that lots and lots of species are being transferred daily to different regions and they never get established. They never become invasive. Okay? And so introduced species happen often, not just from humans, but from other things. Like, you may get organisms that feed in a region, nest in a region, and might fly to another region. They might take aquatic invertebrates from one region to the next, and maybe they get established, maybe they don't. And so there's lots of ways to introduce species. In some cases, those introduced species will outcompete the native populations. When that happens, we often consider that an invasive species. And so, for example, let's say, we look at things like mammals that we moved from mainland to islands. Okay, so lots of islands have no mammals whatsoever. So none of the organisms on those islands ever evolved with mammal predators, or maybe they have no defenses for things that might feed on them, like goats or pigs. Okay, so plants develop defenses against herbivory, and so they'll either produce like a toxin, or maybe they produce thorns, or maybe they produce a sticky material that doesn't taste very well, or lots of ways. Or maybe they entice feeding and have developed reproductive parts for, hey, I'm a tasty apple, eat me, and then when you defecate out, you defecate my seeds out, and now I can grow again. So from an evolutionary perspective, organisms that either evolve with things that consume them will often have some kind of defense, or they go along with the consumption in order for reproduction to happen. But when you introduce species to a region where there is no species is adapted to them, then you can have detrimental effects. And we did this when, in the mid 1800s to late 1800s, when we would take trips and kind of discover the world, plotting all the coastlines. And so Darwin, I'm sure, contributed to the bringing of rats or mice or different organisms to different islands, and it was just part of that kind of exploration. Some were done intentionally, like releasing organisms because maybe you have too much cargo. So maybe you're bringing too much cargo on your ship, and so you might have had a bunch of goats and pigs on the ship to feed sailors, and because it's just too heavy, you just release the animals onto the island, or maybe not even an island, maybe on a different continent, and now they get established. So there's lots of ways at which this has occurred. Sometimes it's to the detriment of the environment. I would say that all four of these have really changed ecosystems. Cats and rats probably more so than any other organism on the planet. Maybe I don't know, maybe mosquitoes, but cats and rats have definitely had a major toll on native fauna in lots of regions. Australia has a notorious record of documenting when cats, when rats, when other organisms were introduced, and how many different native marsupials were lost due to the abundance of these introduced species. And so they can really have a major toll. We'll talk a little bit about the positive, or in some cases there's positive introduced species, or at least from a human perspective, we believe them to be positive, and we'll talk about those in a second after we kind of hit up on the negative. So what do we do? What do you do when you've introduced a rat or a cat to a new ecosystem and their populations explode? Well, I'll tell you what we used to do. We used to introduce a different species, another species, maybe something that could eat the rat, or maybe something that would get rid of the cat. Like, that was the way we initially, after we realized the problem with the introduced species, we'd often say, all right, well, what can consume it? And we'll just introduce that to go out and consume it. On a few minor cases, it worked, but majority of the problem, what it did is it just introduced a new predator that fed at a different trophic level. And so, yeah, they might feed on some rats, but maybe they eat more native marsupials. Maybe they eat other things. And so, like, that's normally what happened. The classic example of this is the cane toad, okay, in Australia. And so the cane toad in Australia is known to, it's called cane toad, like sugar cane toad, because it occurs often in sugar cane plantations. And so, and it keeps grubs and insects that affect the sugarcane, it keeps them to a minimum. Okay? And so when sugarcane was introduced to Australia on purpose, right, to grow sugarcane and use it as a commercial staple, with that sugarcane, when it was introduced, there was pests like grubs and things that would consume it. So naturally, because the cane toad occurs in regions where we grow sugarcane in North America and South America, naturally the idea was, well, let's just introduce the cane toad to Australia to get rid of these pests that are in their sugarcane fields. And that's what happened. The cane toad was introduced. But what many people didn't realize, especially the individuals that did the introduction, is that cane toads are poisonous, and that a lot of the predators of cane toads in their native region have developed the ability to withstand that toxin, and they can consume them, and they can keep the populations, manageable. But Australia had never seen that type of toxin. None of the predators that would eat the cane toad had ever experienced that type of toxin, and the cane toad started killing off many predators. So predators would feed on them because the population of cane toads were exploding, okay, and the predators would feed on them, but they would die. And so what you see is this middle kind of secondary consumer that's now affecting tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers, and affecting things below by consuming lots of grubs, but also native things. So once they would eat some of the sugarcane pests, they'd also migrate out of the sugarcane fields and eat all kinds of native herpetofauna, so native frogs and even reptiles, and they would eat, even like small marsupials and things like that, because nothing had ever reacted to them before, because nothing had ever adapted to that presence of that toad. So it became a really big problem in Australia. But I would say that it pales in comparison to the problems that are brought by some people's favorite pet, and that would be cats. Cats notoriously consume and cause damage to native fauna, okay? Especially when they've been introduced to regions where there is not an apex predator that would affect them like a cat. Cats are very good at hunting, and have been shown to cause billions of dollars of damage to native bird species, native small mammal species, even in regions that are more arid, native reptile species. Cats are by far, in Australia, by far the most prevalent introduced species and most damaging introduced species. Almost $19 billion has been spent or contributed to the introduction of cats. And so just kind of as you go down from 1 to 10 on the most invasive species in Australia, rabbits were introduced to Australia. Huge problem. People were paid for every rabbit they killed for many years, and then they decided, well, the rabbit population's there's just too many rabbits, so we're going to introduce fox. Well, that didn't work because fox ate some of the rabbits, but it also ate native marsupials, and so just on and on and on. You get these this kind of domino effect of one species introduced and then another species introduced to take care of that species, and it just becomes a huge problem. Let's look at the United States. So when we look at the United States, based on billions of dollars that is, contributed to damages, management costs, or some kind of mix of that, mosquitoes are the number one that we spend on management or damages that are contributed to the mosquitoes. Rats and cats come in second and third. Still, we're talking, for mosquitoes, almost $150 billion. Rats and cats, somewhere around that 50 billion or more, contributed to rats and cats. And then you can see there's, just other things. So we're not always talking about, apex predators. Cats can be considered in many cases apex predators. Mosquitoes are, interesting group. Like, these are parasites, so they don't really often fit on a cascade of, a pyramid, because they're parasites and they'll feed at many different trophic levels. So they can feed on apex predators, they could feed on, secondary consumers, primary consumers, so they can feed at all levels. And that's kind of the interesting thing about parasites, is they often feed at every level except for, in many cases, the primary producer level. Rats, again, these are generalists. They can feed at many different trophic levels, which makes, these two very good at adapting to new environments and altering those environments and changing, how that ecosystem operates. And then, if we look down, we have some other interesting things. Invertebrates that are introduced, like termites, of course, that's, they're affecting the primary producers directly. Fire ants are typically affecting either primary producers or primary consumers. The brown tree snake, this is it's a big deal when it comes to nesting birds. They're very good at consuming bird eggs, and in many of these cases, it's the native populations are not adapted to this introduced species, and that's what gives this introduced species the distinct advantage over the native species. Like, the native species has never had, in many cases, especially islands, they never had a snake on an island, and so they never had any defenses against something that climbs into their nest and eats all their eggs. So lots of other ways. So really, that brings me to the last kind of topic I want to talk about, and that's kind of how we go about potentially managing introduced species. Okay? And we'll talk about native and non-native species. Okay, we kind of talked about those before, but there are native species that are what we call aggressive natives. Okay, or maybe you can have real large population explosions of these native species. So locust outbreaks, mice outbreaks, cockroach outbreaks, and so you can have these huge explosions of native species, and we often call them pests. Okay, so we don't call them invasive. We call native species a pest, because they're native. They actually belong there, but we often treat them as not. We don't want to eradicate them. We want to prevent them or contain them. Okay, when we're talking about introduced species, non-native species, okay, then of course we want to prevent, with all species and all community change, we want to prevent the change of the community. Okay, so we want to prevent non-native populations from coming in. We want to prevent native populations from exploding and causing damage. So often we have lots of resources spent at prevention. Okay, boat checks. You've probably seen many checkpoints if you've driven around, especially the western United States. You'll see lots of, hey, get your boat checked here, whatever, because we don't want to move invasive species or native species from one region to another that might not have that population, because they can, again, become pests. So prevention is a big deal. Checking, material through customs and things like that to prevent the transfer of organisms from one country to another. So prevention is a big deal. Once they get established and they're in somewhat manageable population, eradication gets quite a bit of resources. And so the idea is, if you have a small population, a small isolated group, okay, eradicate it as fast as you can. Like, killer hornets that have come about in Washington State. Okay, find out where these nests are, eradicate them, get them out as soon as possible. So lots of resources sent at that. Okay, if the non-native population gets out of these two categories, prevention, eradication, they'll get into containment. Okay, which means that we've basically lost. Which means that we're just trying to keep them in a narrow region. We don't want them to move to another region. And so things like zebra mussels that have been found in the Great Lakes, we don't want the zebra mussels to make it to other bodies of water. And so we try to contain them to a certain region. Okay? We know that we're likely not going to eradicate them, but if we can contain them, then that would be ideal. And then often we would consider suppression is kind of, you've lost and now you're just trying to keep community change at as much minimal community change as possible. So suppression would be the population of non-natives is out of control in many regions. We're just trying to pick and choose regions that we can throw resources at and suppress it. And so organisms like a lot of plant organisms like Scotch broom, this is the case, okay? Especially in Washington State, we have lots and lots of Scotch broom, and we know we're not going to eradicate it. It's very hard to contain because of the wind pollination and the ability for seeds to travel. So in select regions, maybe that there's lots of it, or it might be affecting ecosystems, we try to suppress it as much as possible. Okay, next time out, we're going to talk more about human involvement in kind of community change, and from a perspective of food resources, hunger, what can we do to support our human population, growing human population in the world, without destroying native populations, or at least minimizing the destruction of native regions in order to grow food to support 8.2 billion people. Next time.